Hey, welcome to Microchurch Next. I'm Rob Wegner. That's Brian Johnson. We're going to introduce you to Josh in just a minute, but we're so glad you're here today. Through Leadership Network, we're trying to create a table here, a safe space for anyone who's pursuing simple, hyper-local, deeply rooted, mission-centered, smaller expressions of the church, or what we're calling microchurch and movements thereof. We think of them as extended spiritual families. They're led by ordinary people. The goal is to live in everyday gospel community and own the mission of Jesus in a network of relationships. And this microchurch conversation continues to gain traction. Right now, it's still a minority report here in the West. If you saw our webinar with David Drury, they like to call them, there's this movement of weird little churches. The Spirit of God is birthing, but we do think it's very significant, and that maybe 50 years from now, this is going to be a very significant part of the body of Christ in the West. And we're here to learn from practitioners, not just here in America, but all over the world. And today we get to hang out with Josh Howard, my brother, my buddy, one of my heroes. Josh is the Central Asia Regional Director for New Thing. You're going to hear about the amazing move of God that he's a part of there. And he also leads an organization called Ignite, which equips people in DMM, ideology, and practice here in the West and around the world. And Josh, thanks again, man, for being here this morning. We're really, really grateful.
Hey, it's an honor. And if I'm your hero, bro, you're in trouble, man. You're in big trouble.
Deal with it.
Deal with it.
Deal with my
guys,
problems.
Man. Good to be here.
Live up to my expectations now. Go.
Right.
That's a lot of weight.
Yeah, right.
That way I can just knock you down off that pedestal later, you know?
There you go.
What are we up to today, Brian? I know we're in the middle of this series, man.
Yeah, just to set it up a little bit for you, Josh, we're, again, we talked a little bit earlier before we got on, but just trying to reimagine church as this decentralized network of multiplying disciple makers and microchurches that fill a city or region. We know you're going to have a lot to say on that today as you see that practiced in real life consistently. And it requires this unique form of leadership, a decentralized leadership. And most of us have primarily experienced in the West the centralized leadership structures that they feel more like the pyramids. They don't feel like families oftentimes. And so what does it mean to kind of shift in this way of thinking to circles, to thinking the people of God can step into what he has made them for, and we can come alongside of them to support, to equip, to release, to send. This idea of centralized leadership collects power mostly for the organization, but decentralized leadership treats power as this currency that's available to everyone. And our hope is that, again, all of God's people step into his way for their life, the things that he's set apart for them to do, those good works. But this decentralized form of leadership requires new ways of thinking, new challenges that many of us have maybe never thought through. And so that's part of what we're here today for, is just to add into that conversation today. We want to focus on this idea of what it means of like keeping score and the scorecards, and the way that churches in North America have typically focused on buildings and budgets and butts, the 3 B's. But the fact is, those 3 metrics, they don't really give us a sense of influence that the church is having in our communities. And there's not really any correlation between the number of people that show up somewhere and the number of people that have been equipped and sent on mission to bring beauty, justice, and good news to our city. So I remember and Rob, you'll have to correct me on when this book came out. I think it was like 07, 08. Do you remember Missional Renaissance by Reggie?
Yeah, that's about right. That's a good book.
That was like the first time I'd ever read anything about changing the scorecard. So again, it's not like we're entering into some new conversation. I think deep in our souls, we're all resonating with something that's like, we might not be counting and measuring the right things. And so those 2 words will kind of frame up a little bit of our conversation today. But before we do that, let's go to Josh just to like get to know you a little bit. I know you and Rob know each other well. You're not my hero yet, but there's still time.
So just give him a chance.
Why don't you give us like the 2 to 3 minute version of like, hey, here's my family, here's where we are, and then maybe 2 to 3 minutes on like the ministry, how those two things collide.
Yeah, man. So, my name's Josh. I married a beautiful Indian woman about 14 years ago. Her name's Lashi. We've got 3 incredible kids. My oldest just turned 13. His name's Josiah. Then I've got a 10-year-old Jeremiah, and then our little girl is Zara, and she turns 4 next month. And so they're incredible kids, man, just awesome. My son just turned 13 like a couple weeks ago, so we're in now parenting the teenage world. But he's just an incredible young leader, man. Just we're super proud of him and our second son and our little girl. But yeah, so I literally moved to India about a month before we got married, my wife and I. Her parents started the ministry that I work with mostly about 40 years ago. So that's called Central India Christian Mission. And so I've been working with CICM for the last 14 years, and really mainly laser focused on leadership development, church planting, and multiplication. And so we have an informal school that we run that's basically it's built more like a residency program where we're raising up church planners and sending them out. And then, like Rob mentioned, we started a arm of our ministry about 8 years ago called Ignite, which is laser focused on making disciples who make disciples and planting churches that plant churches. So it's all disciple making movement, church planting movement focused. And that shift radically changed everything within our ministry. I mean, it was we fell on our face many times. We had a lot of mistakes. We try to figure it out as we go. I'm kind of a build the plane in the air kind of guy, you know. So we there's still even now a lot of duct tape on it, but God's doing just unbelievable, incredible things, man. Like what we've been able to see God do in the last 8 years has blown our mind. And now we're at a point where we're just trying to stay out of his way, you know, like, hey, you're doing something really special here, God. So how do we stay out of your way and not screw it up, you know? And so it's been really, really cool to see ordinary people raised up and sent out to make disciples and start churches all over India and the surrounding nations. Really, it's been incredible.
Hey, Josh, why don't you give just kind of when you say disciple making movements that lead to church planting movements, just frame that up for people that might not be super familiar with what that language really means globally.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of tweaks of the definition of what those are. If you talk to many different organizations, they may have some different language around that or different definitions. But basically, at its core, a disciple-making movement really is the key is reclaiming the priesthood of all believers, so that we say it all the time, every believer should be a disciple maker, and every disciple maker can be, they won't all be, but they can be a church planter. Every believer, a disciple maker, every disciple maker can be a church planter. So the idea is that we want to see disciples who make disciples, who make disciples, who make disciples. And then as they form communities, those communities would form more, who would form more, who would form more. And that's where a church planting movement is birthed. And so, the traditional idea of church planting is if you start a service, then you're planting churches. But really, the idea behind the whole movement concept, or especially starting with disciples, is that we know throughout history, man, like you could start with a church service and never get disciples. I mean, you could get church attenders, you could get tithers, you could get, maybe a few disciples every now and then, but most of the time it's in spite of what we're doing, not because of what we're doing. And so we wanted to flip that on its head. We took a page out of Neil Cole's playbook and basically said, what does it look like to raise the bar of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and lower the bar of what it means to be a church, instead of the other way around, right? Historically, it's high bar church, low bar disciple. What does it look like to have a high bar for what a disciple is and a low bar of what it means to be church? And so if every disciple is empowered in their identity and purpose, so that they are out there sharing their faith, making disciples, and forming small groups or microchurches or whatever you want to call them, smaller communities that are multiplying, that is the way that true movement takes shape. So we want to see generational growth. We want to see kids and grandkids and great grandkids and great grandkids of disciples. And we want to see the same thing in the church world in order to saturate a city and saturate a region with the gospel. So it's really about the rapid reproduction and multiplication of disciples and churches across a region until there's no place left.
Amen.
You know, I remember when I heard Neil say that, you know, and I want to say to anyone who's hearing this for the first time, when Josh says lower the bar on what it takes to do church,
it's a good highlight.
He's not talking about a quality level,
right?
It's actually a complexity level,
right?
You know, like we have a very complex form of church in the West in terms of infrastructure and management, and we tend to have weekend services that require and increasingly so over the last 30 or 40 years, like a level of capacity and talent in terms of like arts and communication, and then all the systems behind that for running multiple programs, and we're for every expression of the church. We're not here to like smack down on how God wants to work creatively through different forms of the church. But my experience is actually, as you just personally, you know, lower the bar on what it takes to do church, like it allows for more energy actually to work on the most basic functions of community, actually living out the one another commands, worship, moving from unbelief to belief in Jesus 24/7 in the everyday spaces of life, and mission. Like really smaller, simpler expressions of church can get hyper focused on a particular network of relationships and really make a dent, because they're not trying to reach a city. They're like, I'm trying to reach these 3 blocks with my micro. So I just wanted to add that because I think what Neil gave us there is a real gift, and been trying to live into it too, man, for 15 years.
Oh yeah. And what we found, Rob, honestly, is that the true quality, when you begin to change your definitions of what success is, like what is kingdom success, like we're talking about the scorecard idea, right? When you begin to define kingdom success differently, your idea of quality also changes. So for us, what we've seen is the quality of church has actually skyrocketed because without realizing it, what the truth be under the surface, the truth is the quality of church is directly tied to the quality of disciples you have
100%.
Meeting in that gathering.
100%.
And so when you raise the quality of disciples, people who are head over heels in love with Jesus, on mission with him, they're willing to give their lives for him and for one another. When you have disciples like that, man, your community quality is through the roof. Amen. Because you're loving one another, you're loving Jesus, you're sacrificing for each other. And even though that may not be a big show the way that we sometimes do it in larger settings, the quality of experience that people have are just so much greater when the quality of disciples are higher.
Amen.
That's good. I didn't know we were going to go there in the beginning of this, but I'm glad we did. That was a solid foundation to stand on for the rest of this conversation. So I'm glad you brought up Neil Cole and just that idea. So I want to take us into this conversation on counting and measuring, because you have a ton of language and experience around this. And Rob and I were talking about having this conversation with you and like where to go with it. And he said, oh, you should bring up that organic idea that you talk about. So I'm going to give you the setup that we do with people sometimes. And I'm sure that there's an organic farmer that's watching that's like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I just want to affirm that person. You're right. I don't. It's like this word organic gets thrown around so much that, and I don't think people really understand what they mean when they say it. They're like, I just want it to be organic. And I think in their mind, it's like, it's the parable of the sower, where there's just this random farmer that's just casting seed. Some fell along the path and some fell along the rocks. And it's like, I think people think organic farmers work that way. that they're just out slinging seed, and wherever it lands, something grows, and oh, it just happened.
They're like hippies in a commune. Like,
Yeah.
hey man,
Yeah.
what's up, bro? I'm throwing some seed, man. What's up?
But the truth is, in my understanding, organic farmers in some ways have to work harder because they can't use pesticides, they can't use certain fertilizers or whatever. Like, it's like we have to be very intentional about creating a holistic ecosystem where everything is working together. Otherwise, it can't be certified as purely organic. And so they have to pay attention to so many more things. So the reason I set that up that way is I think sometimes in this conversation about microchurches, there is this fear that we will be overly organic, or if we do anything with structures around it, we're going to kill it, right? So maybe we can't really count anything, or you shouldn't count anything. So that's a little bit of sarcasm, but it's not reality. So
No, I mean, I know I've almost been rebuked by other practitioners sometimes, where it's almost like I'm bad because I counted the number of microchurches, and
right.
You know what I mean? There's an assumption like you're bragging, and we don't do that anymore. We're not doing big church. We're not doing celebrity pastors. And it's like, no, we're not, but we shouldn't stop counting things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not bad. You know what I mean? So I think that's definitely at play in the conversation, at least here in the West.
Yeah. So the question really for you to respond to is like, why is data, why are metrics so important in movements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it may take us a long time to unpack that. What I can speak to is why data in our movement has been so helpful, and what that looks like. So for us, we decided a long time ago that we were going to have to change, like what we're talking about right now. We were going to have to change the scorecard of what kingdom success looks like. We live in a nation of 1.3 billion people. And we knew that the traditional method of reaching people and adding them to traditional churches was never going to get the job done. I remember when we were dreaming of reaching India as a team, right? And I plugged it in my calculator. I tried to come up with the biggest dream I could for how many people could we reach in a year, right? And I thought, man, what if we could reach 100,000 people a year, right, with the gospel? Wouldn't that be amazing? And you plug that into 1.3 billion, and I realized it would take us 13,000 years to reach India. It's
Wow.
like that'll never happen. And even if I added a zero to that, if we reached 1 million people a year, which I don't know that any church or organization is doing, I don't know that anybody's doing that. Even if we did, that's still 1,300 years to reach India, and that's not even the rest of the world, right?
Right.
And so this truth hit me square between the eyes, man. I felt the Holy Spirit say, Josh, every generation is a new Great Commission. Every generation is a new Great Commission. The people living here today were not here 150 years ago. And the people who are going to be here 150 years from now are going to be a whole new generation of people. And so if we're going to see the Great Commission completed, the conviction that the Spirit put on my heart is it's got to be done in our lifetime if it's going to be done, because there are people dying every day without the gospel. And so this sense of urgency began to sweep over us, and we realized addition was never going to get the job done. It had to be multiplication, it had to be rapid multiplication, and it had to be exponential growth so that new disciples were immediately going out and reaching more disciples, right? And so we say this all the time in our movement. We want the harvest field to become the harvest force as quickly as possible. So those that are currently in the harvest field that are not saved yet, they're still lost. The moment they become a believer, we want to raise them up and send them back out as quickly as we can to reach friends and family, right? Because multiplication was the only way to get the job done. So for us, we had to begin to change what we track, what we measure, and what what we were looking at. And so we kind of took, the idea of the leading and lag indicators that's traditionally in the business world, and basically made it a little bit more simple to understand. And we basically started talking about what are the controllables and what are the uncontrollables. What is within our control as followers of Jesus, and what is completely out of our control. And so What was out of our control was like people who said yes to Jesus, right? Like we can't control that. That's completely the Spirit's job, transforming hearts. We can't change that. How many baptisms do we have? Like that's a Holy Spirit thing. Should we track that? 100%. And we do. We count those things, but that's completely out of our control. That's not something that we're actually, we can't own that. What we can own though is how many seeds are we sowing, right? So to use your seed slinger analogy, okay, like how many people are we sharing the gospel with? That's something we can actually control. That's up to me. That's not up to anybody else. I can take full ownership of that I can either open my mouth and tell somebody about Jesus or keep it shut. That's my decision. What happens with that person is completely up to the Spirit. But what I do with the seeds that are in my hand, that's up to me. That's completely within my control. How many invitations am I giving into Discovery Bible Studies? How many invitations am I giving? Because I can't control if they say yes or no. I can control whether or not I'm inviting people into Discovery Bible Studies to encounter God and learn more about Him. How many hours are we spending together every week in prayer corporately? How many hours are we spending in the presence of the King? That's something completely within my control, right? So all these things, and then we begin to ask different questions. Rather than how many baptisms, we begin to ask how many baptizers do we have? How many everyday people are baptizing more people? Rather than saying how many disciples do we have, we started asking how many disciple makers do we have? Rather than saying how many pastors do we have, how many church planters do we have? How many of them are actually going and planting more churches? Or rather than saying how many pastors or leaders do we have, how many trainers do we have? How many people are going out and training more believers to go make more disciples? You see, all those are new multiplication questions. They're no longer addition questions. And so we begin to ask those different questions in order to track things differently. And the reason why this was so key for us, okay? And then one more thing that I forgot to mention, we stopped counting. I mean, we still count how many new churches are started, but that's not as important to us anymore. Mm-hmm. What's more important is the generations of churches that are being started. Mm-hmm. And so is this church starting another one that starts another one that starts another one? How many generations of disciples do we have? How many generations of churches do we have? Because for movement, that's way more important than how many campuses do I have, or how many churches have been started around my hub. It's different. It's a different ball game. It's a different measure of success. And so if we want to see a nation of 1.3 billion people reach, and we want to saturate the area with the gospel, it's going to have to be, crazy rapid multiplication throughout an entire region to see that take place, right? So for us, as we begin to track that, and as we began to measure that, no longer for us was it about measuring. It wasn't about reporting. It wasn't about David counting how many, troops he has, so that he could brag about that or be proud of that. For us, all of our stats that we have are directly tied to our coaching and mentoring of our leaders. So we use data in order to coach and mentor our leaders, in order to make sure that the movement is healthy, that it's growing, and we're focused on the things that Jesus has called us to focus on. So we don't collect reports ever for reporting's sake. Reports are given in the context of coaching in order to make sure that they are moving forward in the movement and more churches and more disciples are being made. Mm-hmm. And so reporting is actually secondary. Coaching and mentoring is first, and that's where the data comes in. Does that make sense? Oh, yeah, so that's why it's so important for us, because data fuels the coaching and mentoring that we do. It's how we overcome problems. It's how we ensure the health of the movement. It's how we ensure the generational growth of churches and disciples. It's how we ensure the multiplication of all of that. It's by using that data to coach and mentor our guys and gals as well.
Super helpful, man. Collecting data within the context of coaching and mentoring, that makes all the difference. Because now it's a conversation about me helping another reach their maximum influence in their calling. Mm-hmm. And it's not
about
so
relationship.
Much, me kind of raising the banner for my organization as it is. I care about what the Spirit of God's doing in and through you. And so we ask questions, just that any good farmer would ask about how
Yeah.
we're stewarding what's been given to us, you know.
Yeah.
One of the distinctions we're making in this conversation today is the difference between counting and measuring. And so counting is basically about how many, and measuring is about how far. And so we wanted to see if you could, so for example, like we can count, like you said, it's a lagging indicator, but we can count how many people have been baptized. But one of the things that is maybe, and we see this especially here in the West, because, you know, the family system has been pretty well devastated. So relational networks are pretty fractured. So for example, one of the things that we'll measure is we talk about the blessed rhythms, like begin in prayer, listen and engage, eat, serve, story. A lot of missionaries in the West, there's a slow burn in a lot of contexts because the relational networks are so fragile. You're almost building a new relational network. Like that's what we had to do in our neighborhood. And you can't do that in a week, you know? So we talk about measuring like, hey, how many meaningful conversations did you have? You know, and what was kind of the quality of those conversations? Or and it's not meant to be like a data point where it's like I had 12.5, but it's more like a measuring question to like get a sense of vibe on, is there been some momentum, or we call it social momentum? Has there been some social momentum? So we're curious, you know, what do you guys count? What are the things that you're counting? And are there things that you measure? And what are those things?
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I would say as we're having our coaching and mentoring meetings, and by the way, that's to clarify, it's a peer-to-peer coaching and mentoring all the way down the movement. So multipliers are getting together and mentoring and peer coaching one another. They do what we call gen maps, or generational maps of their churches. So it'll be on one big piece of paper. So this church started this church, and this church started this church. And it's literally on one piece of paper, the entire network and movement within that stream. And we can see it all on one piece of paper. So as they're having that conversation, yeah, they're still counting how many people are attending those things. You know, how many baptisms have we had? How many people have said yes? They're still counting all those things. How many of those are there? You know, how many of those groups are actually current and active? They're counting those. They're counting the generational growth of those, which I would actually put that in the measure category, just because of how far the movement has gone. So we wouldn't necessarily say the generational growth is counting, it's more measuring. So we want to see if this disciple made a disciple who made a disciple who made a disciple, how many generations does that stream actually go? And how wide is it, and how far down is it? So how many are there in each of the lines of generational growth? And so we track that at a church level, a group level. So how many groups have been started by each, you know, leader, and then those groups, how many have they started, and those groups, how many have they started? And so we're wanting to measure the width and the breadth of that movement by generational growth and impact. So we're definitely measuring that. And yeah, we'll ask things like what you said, Rob. How many gospel shares have actually happened, or spiritual conversations? We'll use that sometimes as well, similar to what you just said. Like I mentioned earlier, invitations into a discovery Bible study. We talk about that as well. And so these are all areas where we are basically wanting to make sure that each disciple is being coached and mentored in their personal rhythms and habits as a follower of Jesus. What does that look like? And then we want to make sure that the churches are also growing and multiplying and being healthy. And so we're measuring the health of those churches by what they're doing when they're together. Are they actually discipling people? Are they sending people out? All those things. So it's really a mixture of counting and measuring, depending on what part of the movement we're looking at.
Yeah.
So one quick clarifying question: when you talked about like checking in on the spiritual health of the individual leader, is that a general question, or is it actually really specific? Is it more like, hey, how's it with your soul? How's it with you and Jesus? Or is it more like, hey, checking in on a core set of spiritual habits, for example?
Yeah, it's specific. So we do these
Okay.
meetings that we call 139s. That's kind of it's our form of a network meeting it's a network leader meeting that happens once a month. The idea of a 139 is actually a leader has 3 people that he's pouring into at least. That's where the 3 is. And then those 3 would have their 3, which is where the 9 comes from. So it's like the 2 Timothy 2:2 idea, right? Paul says to Timothy, teach other people so that they can teach more. It's that idea. So basically in those 139 meetings, yes, we're asking very specific questions about their time with Jesus, their abiding, their spiritual rhythms and spiritual practice, what their disciplines are currently looking like. And again, this isn't with a stick. This is brother to brother, peer to peer, in a mutually agreeable relationship that has literally been like, we have asked one another to ask me these, like it is permission given to ask these questions. So
Right.
It's not a leader coming in with a stick. Brian, did you do this week? If not, you're a loser, man. Like you suck, right? Or Rob, I can't believe, you're not spending time with Jesus for 5 hours a day or whatever. Like it's not like that. It's very much a peer-to-peer. We're asking one another because we've made a commitment to the King of Kings, and we're helping one another live out that commitment to the King. And so we're prodding one another on and encouraging one another on in order to do the work that we've committed to do for the King. And so, yes, we're asking very specific spiritual questions as well during that time. So we're looking at our personal lives and family, and also the ministry and multiplication of the work as well. We're looking at both of those things to see the health of the leader and the health of the work.
Yeah, this goes back to this. It's not just about quantity, but quality. So what is the quality of my journey with Jesus? Like that is important to pay attention to. If you reproduce who you are. So if there's not quality and depth growing there, that next generation or down is not going to have that same level. So.
And Jesus was serious, man, when he said, apart from me, you can do nothing. Like abiding in me is everything. That's basically what Jesus said. And so if our guys are not abiding, it's going to massively affect the downstream of that work and of their family and of their soul, all of that. And so we want to make sure that it's healthy in every area.
Well, and there won't be a downstream if we're not abiding. I mean, that's what Jesus has consistently been bringing me back to that passage over and over lately. Just I'm like, I know the way that I've been formed, and I know the cultural context in which I exist. And I feel if I'm not up and to the right, then I'm feeling some deficiency. But he just keeps saying, it's about abiding in me. You can't manufacture your way into growth. You can't manufacture your way into multiplication. So the depth of our abiding will certainly be mirrored in the depth of our multiplication. I want to take us to a kind of a practical side of this. So you said, you got these teams that are peer-to-peer coaching, and they're doing these gen maps. And so they have a big piece of paper and they're mapping it out. And I'm thinking about how big you guys are going and how big you're thinking in multiplication. And I'm thinking, is this like 1,000 sheets of paper that you're gathering together? I know that's not what it is, but nobody really wants to collect data at some level, but we all want to collect data because we know it's important. But it can be tedious, and we want to have integrity about it. We don't want to just be like, well, I think there's 2 generations happening over here. So what are the practical ways that you go about collecting data, with the effective ways that you found to really stay true to what is true, that might help kind of a network leader over here in the West go, okay, we can look into this. Like we can begin to think more holistically about what we're paying attention to. And this is a practical way to count or to collect.
Yep, absolutely. So two or three, I may come up with a third as we talk, 2 or 3 main ways that we found this to be more helpful and streamlined. So number one, so the pieces of paper are done, and those aren't in a group of leaders. You're only usually going to have 5 or 6 leaders in a room, peer-to-peer mentoring and coaching each other. And the gen maps are only have to be done quarterly. We're not tracking those monthly. So that's once a month that one guy is on the hot seat in the 139 doing his gen map, and we're asking tough questions about it. Hey, what's going on here? What's happening here? Hey, this group's been meeting for a long time. There's no baptisms, but they're still meeting and studying the Bible. Should we do a baptism study with that group? We're asking very specific questions. But it's only it's only a quarterly gen map for each of the leaders. A way that it's been super helpful to collect that centrally, just in order to help us see the health of the entire movement. Some incredible guys created an app that is literally called Gen Mapper, and you can do it all digitally, and you can have a team on the website or on the app on your phone. And at the moment a gen map is done, all that data is sent to the leader's phone and app as well. So if you have an entire network and you've got multiple meetings like that happening, when it's all put into the app, it all comes centrally to the team leader, basically, in order to be able to see everything and take a look at it and just see what's going on. It automatically counts it for you within the app. So you don't have to, like all the counting stuff Rob was talking about, it does it automatically as you enter it all in. And so you're able to see how far the generations are, how many baptisms, how many people are attending, all that within just literally just looking at it. So that's been super, super helpful. If you go, I believe it's genmapper.com is the website. And if you go to that, it's a site. You could do it a web app or a phone app. That's really, really awesome. So that helps massively. In areas of India that technology isn't the easiest to come by, or people aren't as tech savvy. It's literally just the relational, connections up the line. So for example, usually on their cell phones, they'll take a photo of the gen map that was drawn out on a piece of paper if they're not able to do it technologically. And then that's sent up to their 139 group, because if you're leading a 139, you're also in a 139 too, that somebody is pouring into you and coaching you if you're leading one as well.
So it's twice a month then?
It'd be twice a month for the person if they're in one and leading one. Yes.
Got it.
It would be a twice a month meeting for those people. Now, down the line, a lot of times, because it is peer-to-peer, and all of that, there will be times where the person that's leading it is also getting coached and mentored if it really is a peer-to-peer thing and they're all around the same level of movement. They don't necessarily have to be in another one. But sometimes you have a guy that's leading multiple streams of churches and he's coaching and mentoring guys that aren't, and he needs to be a part of 139 with peers that are at a similar level of movement that he is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So anyway, go ahead, Rob.
A question, and this will kind of take us closer to landing the plane. I'm kind of a old guy. You know what I mean? I'm 52.
Hey,
so
you're young, man. You still got a lot of ministry left, bro. A lot of ministry left.
But I have seen the whole church growth movement. And I remember in like the late 90s, early 2000s, there'd be these conferences and meetups. And there was always these conversations about, how many people you're running, man? How many services you guys got going on, And part of me looking back, I'm like, it's so disgusting, because it really was coming out of people growing their brands. And don't get me wrong, there was good motives too. People wanted the lost to be found. So as we changed the scoreboard, I could see there being a swap of like, how many gens you got, man? How many gens? You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
How do we make sure it doesn't drift into that same sort of obsession? Like I'll be honest with you, for example, like I don't know, this may get us in trouble. We'll find out. My boss at Leadership Network, Carrie, give me a call if I'm out of whack. But like Outreach now it's not just fastest growing. They have like, what is it? most reproductive or something like that. So now they're tracking like level 4, level 5, and one of the people behind that has really leaned hard a couple times into the Kansas City Underground. Like, you guys really got to fill this out. And I was like, I don't want to fill this out. No, you got to fill this out. And then I went and looked at it, and I was like, I can't even fill out your form, really, because it's still got a lot of the old scoreboard on it. So we haven't. Right, but even if we could, I don't know if I'd want to anymore. I'm not sure I don't know, is it helpful? Or is it just more like another beauty pageant? We just put the ladder on another wall. You know what I mean? So I just want to open that up to go, what are your thoughts on all that, man?
It is a danger for all of us, no matter what score. I mean, I think it's just a human frailty that no matter what scoreboard you're using, you want to win, and some of that's healthy ambition. Some of it's healthy, good ambition. But then when you're comparing, what you've got to other people, and you feel pride about what you have versus what they have, and, oh, I've got way more generations and way more reproduction happening than you do, or whatever. It's such a, like you said, it's really a sickening, nauseous thing, because we really need to. The only way this is actually going to truly get to a point that it needs to is when all of us decide together that we have to lay down our little K kingdoms for God's big K kingdom. Mm-hmm. And that it is not about what I've personally accomplished for the sake of the kingdom or whatever, because the truth is, man, if you're really running after true movement, none of these are my churches. None of them. It's all, you've got to release authority. You have to release influence. If you talk to churches that are 3 or 4 generations down the line with an Ignite, they've never even heard of Ignite. They don't know who I am. They don't know who any of our leaders are. You know what I mean? And so, like, down the line within the movement, there's no room for pride and arrogance and I'm leading this thing or whatever. There's no room for that. Mm-hmm. Where it's a temptation is when you're talking to other movement leaders and other people that are leading that. And then you start saying, well, I've got this and you've got that. And it is, man, it's dangerous. I think, though, here's what I would say in a positive side. At this stage of the global church, and when the minority of people are still the ones that are actually pursuing true reproduction, a disciple-making movement and things like this, telling the story about what God has done with reproduction and multiplication and how far it's gotten and how wide it is still a very healthy thing to inspire the action of other people that are not pursuing multiplication and movement right now. Mm-hmm. But we have to do it very carefully so that it doesn't start getting to our heads and we start becoming the new, mega church pastor celebrity. But instead of a mega church, now we're a movement leader that has that same, celebrity idea. And we just have to be careful of that. Right. And I mean, you guys know, and I know personally, I've got great friends that are incredible mega church celebrity pastors. They're the most humble, kind, loving, amazing people in the world. Mm-hmm. And I've met other guys that I would never be friends with those, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I'd never be friends with them. Like, I think it's in the heart of every leader, man, that some of us are going to take it and get all the glory. And some of us are not. I think there's a very clear reason why in the book of Revelation, it talks about the elders surrounding the throne, and they are constantly throwing their crowns at the feet of Jesus. It's as if it has to be done over and over and over again, not just one time. You don't one time lay your crown down. It somehow, as human beings, it slowly creeps back on our head where we start feeling really, really good about it. And we've got to throw it down again. And so I feel like as leaders, it's just up to us to consistently and constantly be throwing our crowns down before the feet of the King, giving him all the credit and glory, and also praising, celebrating, and honoring the other brothers and sisters around us that are doing similar work. It's going to have to look something like that.
Man, I just thank you for saying all that, for sure. Because I think we're with you for sure. Like, in that place of, I don't want to just tell you numbers for the sake of my glory, but for the sake of what Jesus is doing. And even embed that into our coaching and into our team DNA, that we're bringing that up with each other of, hey, before we start throwing this data, does anybody remember why we're doing this? And that as we say, like, hey, there's 2 generations. Can we just lead in with praise Jesus, there's 2 generations? Or before we say we had 18 baptisms, can we just say, praise God, there were 18 baptisms? Just like reframe the language around how you present it. But I think the other thing that, man, just really stood out to me, and I hope everybody caught this too, was you said it earlier, but the practical outgrowth, or the practical comment you made of like, data leads to better questions. You're just like, this group over here has been meeting for a while, but they've had no baptisms. Should we equip them in how to do a baptism study? So maybe it highlights it for them. It's like, that's why, to take it back to the first question, why do we do things? So it can highlight where there's some barriers. So it can highlight where we need some breakthrough, not just for the sake of counting, but for the sake of helping us identify where Jesus might be at work in some things, or determining, like, and we always tell people, share the hope is this reproducing microchurch in the underground. It's just a hot spot with men that have been affected by incarceration and their families. And so there's a reason we keep celebrating that there's a new one this week. Something's happening there. Jesus, teach us whatever is happening there so that we can maybe reproduce it somewhere else. It's not for the sake of just going, it's way to go, guys. But what is Jesus highlighting that the rest of us need to learn from?
Yeah.
Well, that's a helpful reframing, Josh. I really appreciate
so good, man.
The way that you've seen this, and
just for us,
but yeah,
just the Kansas City Underground alone was like, whew, that's super helpful.
Well,
yeah.
Oh, by the way, let me tell you how many churches we should. No, I'm just kidding.
Bro, how many gens, bro?
Yeah, how many gens we got, bro?
If you guys start slinging bro around,
got some gyms. Got some gyms. Gens.
Josh, we've mentioned Ignite. How can people connect with you for just learning more about what you're doing or coaching or anything like that?
Yeah, man. I mean, if people want to shoot me an email, that would be awesome. Probably a good email address is josh@indiamission.org. So just josh@indiamission.org. So if somebody wants to shoot me an email, and if they, because honestly, here's the deal, guys, with real movement stuff, we really, really just want to give away the kingdom. And so we want to serve anybody that has a dream and a vision to see multiplication and movement take shape. Man, we would love to serve in any way that we can in order to help make that shift and help empower churches and leaders to do it. And so whatever that looks like, if you guys have questions or pushback or whatever, shoot me an email. Would love to chat.
Well, one last thing, Josh, just trying to open the door for leaders that join us on this. If there's like a word of encouragement or something the Spirit will give you right now, just to encourage leaders that are thinking about changing their scorecard, dreaming about different things, what might he say through you to us to challenge or encourage us?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, here's the deal. Most movement, we hear about movement all the time as like it's this crazy exponential growth curve and all of that. The truth is, what we've seen and what we've seen in hundreds of other groups and movements across the world is that it's usually more like a J curve. You actually go down before you start going up. You actually lose people who don't want to be a part of it. You have people coming against you. Jesus reminded me all the time when we first started Ignite, it wasn't the Romans who killed Jesus, it was the Jews. It was his own people coming against him. And so you may have some of that and you may be discouraged. And it's not, listen, movement is not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of dedication and focus, but there is nothing greater that you could give your life to than to see movements of disciples multiplied across your city and your state, because it's through disciples who make disciples, real, true followers of Jesus who look like him, act like him, and talk like him. If you can multiply those across your city and your state, that's what's going to bring real gospel transformation. And so there's nothing greater that you could give your life to. So jump in, don't look back, take the matrix pill. And you're never, man, you will never be able to do the old thing again. And it will radically change your life and your ministry. And so stay with it, stay encouraged. And if you want to gripe and moan to somebody about how difficult it is, just give me a call and we'll chat through it together.
Amen. That's so good. Well, we appreciate you joining us today. It's a rich conversation. And for those that are with us, hope that you'll connect with Josh if there was something that was encouraging to you, or if you just want to complain to him, apparently you're free to do that.
Or heckle him. I heckle him a lot.
Please heckle.
Check out genmapper.com if you're looking for a practical tool to think about how you count and how to just track what Jesus is doing within your network. And we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday as we continue in this conversation about the new wineskin for leadership within microchurch movements. Grace and peace.